So, we've had the PlayStation 5 for a full week now. In that time, we found a lot to love and some things that still need some love. We'd like to share some of those things with all of you. Just a quick note that all the gameplay captured in this video is from the earliest parts of each respective title, with the exception of a few last-gen games, so beware minor spoilers for Red Dead Redemption 2 and God of War, depicted in some of the gameplay. Taking a brief look at the box itself, you have to acknowledge its size. The thing is beefcake, and if you saw our PS5 unboxing, you'll know. It's just shy of 16 inches tall on the stand, and plenty of folks have had trouble finding a spot for it to fit around their entertainment center, resulting in some hilarious and admittedly a bit sad blockages of a portion of their TV screen. This might be an obstacle for some folks, or perhaps many folks, to take into consideration. This tall, uprightness does sort of serve as a visual motif for these consoles' slow transformation into what are essentially mini PC towers too, though. Other than form factor, the console does sport a couple of small differentiations from its predecessor that some may want to be aware of. With regard to I/O, the super speed USBs and HDMI 2.1 are considerable and necessary upgrades, but the new console has opted to forego the optical out that the PlayStation 4 had included. Not a huge deal, but may affect the transition in some people's setups. Now, with regard to function and features, the UI has of course received a complete redesign, and its new appearance is sleek, edges more minimalist, and is certainly more open than the PS4 UI. It consolidates a variety of facets and pushes things out of the way in favor of simplicity and visual appeal. Navigating is simple, and locating different apps, media, and settings has become easier for the most part. For example, switching between PS4 and PS5 versions of cross-gen titles is surprisingly simple and intuitive, which seems almost odd considering it's a feature that will likely only see heavy use during this transitional stage where more players technically own two versions of the same game. Similarly, playing backwards compatible PS4 games both via disc or purchased digitally from the newly designed PlayStation Store is clean and completely unobtrusive, generally as easy as playing a PlayStation 5 game. Games and media have also been split into their own respective tabs on the home screen, which does help keep things from getting too muddled together. Meanwhile, the quick menu finds new life on the PS5 too. Just as it did on the PS4, it gathers many useful functions accessible with just the push of the PlayStation button, but it's far more open and clean this time around, obstructing virtually none of the screen, as opposed to most of the screen, as it did on PS4. It's worth noting that a tap and a hold of the PlayStation button have pulled a full 360, no pun intended, and now a tap brings up the quick menu and a hold pulls you back to the home screen. It makes sense, after all the quick menu should be relative to the quicker input, but PS4 veterans may need to take some time to retrain their brains in order to adjust. There's also a good sum of little quality of life improvements that may go unnoticed, but coalesce to make a felt difference, such as spoilers being hidden on videos or being able to tap R1 while typing to autocomplete the first word of the suggestion pool. On the flip side, there are a few more criticisms to be had of the UI as well. In all this minimizing and simplifying, it would seem that some apps or features that don't fit neatly under one umbrella or the other kind of get shoehorned into a category that might not seem immediately apparent. For example, I had experimented with the new Create button, the successor to the Share button, taking a few screenshots and saving a few video clips, but it took me almost 5 minutes to find the capture gallery where they were stored. Ultimately, I had to go to the Games library, move to the Installed Games tab, and go to the bottom where I finally located it. And speaking of organization and categorization, there's still a few features that seem to be missing, like folders. Which is ironic because the PlayStation 4 launched without folders, and it became a heavily requested feature which they added in an update later on, which does sort of solidify the practice of adding features over time as par for the course, even when it comes to features that some might consider essential. And speaking of things added over time, at launch the M2 expansion slot is disabled and will remain dormant until a future update enables it. With about 667 gigabytes of usable storage space on the PlayStation 5's internal SSD, space will become an issue for some people, and for some it'll happen faster than others. Our drive is pretty much already full. At launch, it pretty much boils down to what games and how many you decide to purchase. Call of Duty Black Ops has been the infamous example, as it takes up around a fifth of the drive. Anyone who said that space would not be an issue at launch also clearly had no interest in installing backwards compatible games on the internal drive. You can of course install PS4 games on an external drive, but then the enhancements you receive are lessened significantly without the speed of the internal SSD. And one of the things we found most exciting on the new console is the improved load times, even without optimizations on last-gen games. Some, of course, receive more of a boost than others. God of War, for example, received only a slight boost, while others get something much more significant. Loading into a quest in Monster Hunter World in under 10 seconds is a blissful experience. Also, at launch, there has been some issues with external storage on PS5, so that's something to consider as well. As we expected would happen at the launch of a new console, we've encountered some operating issues ourselves, but luckily avoided the worst of it. Moving back to performance, PlayStation 5 titles are a mixed bag right now, and the sample size isn't quite big enough to draw any general conclusions about the console's performance capabilities in general. But we will say we've seen some things that impress and excite us, as well as things that make us cringe a bit. Despite the hardware being more developer-friendly than it might have been in particular instances in the past, looking at you, PS3 cell processor, this is still new hardware that studios are developing on, and for many of them, they were developing both current-gen and next-gen builds of these games. So, some bugginess and rough edges are to be expected. Combine this with the fact that some of these features, such as native 4K and real-time ray tracing, are making their console debut here. This results in some limitations too, such as Watch Dogs Legion being locked at 30 frames per second on PlayStation 5 in order to run all the fancy next-gen bells and whistles. This might be a limitation of the hardware or simply a hurdle to be overcome with time and experience. Developers always seem to innovate and find ways to accomplish feats that shouldn't really be possible on the hardware they're developing for. It's honestly one of the most exciting parts of seeing a console generation mature. And speaking of things that shouldn't be possible, how? Like how? I would say in general, first-party PlayStation titles have definitely seen a bit more polish than their third-party counterparts, which is just logical. To keep this impressions video a little bit brief, I think the last, but certainly not least thing we'd like to mention is the controller. It's an impressive piece of hardware, and it's frankly one of the most technically impressive components of the PS5. It remains ergonomic, making small tweaks from the DualShock 4 that are accompanied by a suite of under-the-hood improvements that already have shown a beautifully aligned and immersive relationship with a variety of titles. The haptics are definitely impressive. What Nintendo pioneered in the console space, Sony has definitely taken to an entirely different level. We've already seen some innovative implementations and felt everything from the smallest blips to massive tremors. This works in chorus with the adaptive triggers too. They've breathed new life into shooting, which, let's be honest, is what most of us spend a good chunk of our gaming time doing, and their other applications are enticing as well. And finally, the touchpad seems a degree more accurate too. We do worry about the lifetime of the controller though, particularly with regard to the adaptive triggers. Some implementations, such as simulating trigger break, are rather violent, for lack of a better term, and are actively resisting the directionality of your inputs. That said, we don't know the engineering behind it, and ultimately only time will tell. Oh, and the controller is white, so with that time and heavy use, without proper and consistent care, it'll probably get pretty grody. So, to round up, the console is impressive in many respects and has some growing to do in others. This is all to be expected of a new console. I would say to the naked eye, the differences between PS4 Pro and PS5 versions of many cross-gen games aren't as significant as one might think, at least not as of yet, but they do show potential for the future. Obviously, that jump does get a little more significant from a vanilla PS4 to PS5. At this point, if you've been hoping to get a PS5 but haven't managed to pick one up yet, don't sweat it. There exists only a small number of games that are playable only on these next-gen consoles, and current-gen versions of many of the cross-gen games play almost identically to their PS5 counterparts. And when you do ultimately get your PS5, the majority of these titles offer free PS5 upgrades, the process of which is actually pretty straightforward. Anyway, thanks for watching, folks. Don't forget to leave a like or a comment, and if you liked what you saw, a sub would be greatly appreciated. We're a channel that's trying to grow, and we'd love to get to a point where we could spend more of our time making nerd culture and otaku-related content. And if you're interested, your support can help us get there. Anyway, thanks again, everyone.